Imagine a life where every Monday is not just the start of the week, but the beginning of a nightmare. This was the reality of Emily Miller, a woman who for years lived imprisoned in silence, carrying wounds that went far beyond her skin. But what happens when pain turns into strength and the victim decides to write her own destiny? This is not just a story of violence, it is a story of resilience, revenge, and rebirth. And I want you to discover every detail of this thrilling journey, filled with twists, striking characters, and moments that feel like scenes from a movie. But before diving into this powerful narrative, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss a single chapter of this story that might change the way you see courage and freedom. Richard Miller turned Mondays into a spectacle of pain. It was as if the beginning of the week became the stage for his cruelty. He didn't just raise his hand against Emily. He made sure to remind her that without him she had no value at all. With every blow came the cutting phrase, "It's my money that keeps this house." Words that weighed heavier than any physical aggression. Emily, orphaned from an early age and without siblings, repeatedly heard that she had no one in the world. Richard exploited this condition like an executioner who knows exactly where the wound is. Every Monday his voice echoed through the house. "Without me, you are nothing." It wasn't just a speech. It was the construction of a psychological prison. A prison without visible bars, but one that immobilized her soul. The cycle was predictable. Monday became a synonym for terror. It didn't matter what had happened the day before, the routine was already set. Violence and humiliation. Emily's silence was proof that the pain was not only in the bruises, but mainly in the soul that remained quiet. Yet this silence concealed something Richard would never notice. For him, the logic was simple and cruel. Money gave him the right to control, to command, to destroy. Emily, with no close relatives, seemed like the perfect victim to uphold this illusion of power. Richard repeated the same words with precision as if he were writing a macabre script, and Emily watched the scene repeat itself, again and again, believing there was no escape. Each week, Emily became more withdrawn. Her mind, scarred by words, believed she depended on him to survive. After all, where could she go? Who would take her in? These questions echoed in her head like invisible chains. The fear of loneliness seemed greater than the pain. And that is exactly where many abusers find their strength, in the victim's isolation. Richard needed no excuses to act. It wasn't clothes out of place or food arriving late. The mere fact that it was Monday was enough. He had turned the day into a ritual of domination, and by imposing this routine, he made it seem as though the blame was hers. As if Emily had provoked every aggression, even when she had done nothing at all. This pattern of abuse revealed a harsh reality. Violence is not only in the physical act, but in the constant manipulation aimed at erasing someone's identity. Emily was reduced to a shadow inside her own home. With every phrase, Richard tried to convince her that without him there was no future. And for a time this idea kept her motionless. Even so, within Emily there was a spark. Something small but still alive. Every Monday, while hearing the humiliations, a silent question was born. Is this really all that's left for me? This question, though timid, began to open cracks in the prison Richard had built. And cracks, no matter how small, always announce greater ruptures. Richard, in his arrogance, did not realize he was planting the opposite of what he wanted to reap. By trying to crush Emily, he was awakening in her the need to seek something beyond pain. And this silent need would soon transform into an even heavier burden, the silence she carried every single day. Emily carried within her the weight of a suffocating secret. Every Monday left marks not only on her body but in invisible places where the pain settled and multiplied. The silence she kept was not a choice, but survival. To speak meant risking, even more. And the fear of Richard was a wall that seemed insurmountable. That silence became a kind of inner prison. Emily woke up and went to sleep with it, as if it were a constant shadow. With every new assault, what remained was not just the physical memory, but the crushing weight of not being able to tell anyone. Loneliness became the inseparable companion that filled every corner of her life. While Emily sank into hidden pain, Richard seemed to have another focus: pleasing his lover, Vanessa Carter. He believed his violence was an act of devotion, as if each attack were proof of love for someone who manipulated him. This perverse distortion made the burden Emily carried in silence even heavier. Emily's silence was not the absence of a voice, but the reflection of a system of fear. She feared that if she spoke, no one would believe her. She worried about being judged, rejected, or even abandoned. And so, she kept inside herself a pain that grew like a secret flame, corroding every piece of hope she still had. Her life became a performance. She smiled at neighbors, greeted acquaintances, but inside she screamed without sound. This dissonance between what she showed and what she felt consumed her slowly. Silence was like a mask she wore every day, a mask that grew heavier each time she had to hide behind it. Meanwhile, Richard played the role of provider in public, a respected and even admired man. No one imagined that behind that image was an abuser who fed his vanity through someone else's pain. His reputation was the shield that made Emily's silence all the more inevitable. It was in this contrast that the burden became unbearable. On one side, a woman suffocated by pain. On the other, a man who lived as if nothing was wrong. Her silence was not merely a personal decision, but the reflection of the manipulation and image Richard had built for himself. A double prison, the inner and the outer. This burden, however, was not limited to Emily. The silence of victims is an echo that passes through generations, families, and societies. When words are stifled, pain grows deep roots, often invisible, contaminating every aspect of life. Emily, without realizing it, was living a story that countless others had endured in secret. And even while silent, Emily felt something had to change. The silence was too heavy to carry alone. Inside her, doubt was already transforming into necessity. If she could no longer live this way, she would have to find someone to trust. But who could she turn to in a world that felt so distant? Emily, tired of the endless cycle of pain, realized that keeping everything inside only fed Richard's power. It was as if every silence was another brick in the wall that separated her from freedom. Then she remembered Sarah Johnson, her distant cousin who lived in another city just a few hours away. It wasn't just a memory, but the spark of a possible way out. Confessing her pain to someone was an immense step. Emily feared judgment, feared not being taken seriously. Yet inside her, something no longer stayed quiet: the need for change. She decided to write a short letter, simple but heavy with meaning. She asked for help, she asked for a path, she asked for a chance. Sarah, always affectionate even from afar, received that message as a cry for help. She didn't ask questions that could increase Emily's shame. She simply offered to listen. Her empathy worked like an unexpected balm, and for the first time in years, Emily felt she wasn't completely alone. Trust, though fragile, began to return. At that moment, the idea of having a job became a symbol of freedom. Emily wasn't looking for luxury, nor recognition. She only wanted something that could support her escape, an honest job that would guarantee her daily bread. The very act of imagining herself being paid for her own effort already gave her hope. Richard could never know. Any slip could mean the end of the plan before it even began. So Emily learned to disguise herself even more. She hid coins and bills in unlikely places, inside old books sewn into the hem of a skirt tucked away in a jar at the back of the kitchen. Every cent was a seed for the future. With every discreet call to Sarah, Emily felt she was building another step on the staircase of her liberation. They spoke quickly, like people afraid of being discovered. Sarah, on the other end, promised she would do everything she could to help. It was an invisible chain of courage that grew stronger despite the distance. This phase of secrecy demanded an unprecedented strength from Emily. She had to smile at Richard, cook as if nothing had changed, and at the same time nurture within herself the flame of a new life. It was like acting on a stage where only she knew the play was about to change. The risk was immense, but the desire was greater. The plan was still uncertain, but courage was becoming tangible. Emily understood that she could not control Richard's behavior, but she could control her own steps. That realization was a turning point, where before she saw only walls, she now began to glimpse doors. Small doors, discreet, but real, and, deep down, Emily already knew. The secret wasn't just about saving money or finding a job. It was about rebuilding herself. Every hidden gesture was also a silent affirmation that she deserved to live differently. What was still missing was the right moment, that instant when courage and opportunity would finally meet. A week after her confession, the phone rang, bringing a thread of light. Sarah Johnson, always firm and loyal, called with good news. She had found a job for Emily in a small local diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a beginning. For Emily, it sounded like the first door finally opening. On the other end of the line, Sarah offered not only work but shelter. Her house, simple and welcoming, would be available until her cousin received her first paycheck. Sarah's generosity was like a balm, showing that bonds of blood and affection could be stronger than pain. Hearing this, Emily felt her chest expand with something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. That hope began to transform her days in secret. Every hidden coin, every folded bill now had a concrete purpose: the ticket to a different future. Once paralyzed by pain, she now found motivation in each small gesture. Like a moth drawn to distant light, she began to plan her escape with patience. Sorting belongings became a silent ritual. A photograph here, a notebook there, and the rest was left behind. There was no space for everything, only for the essential. And in that process, Emily learned to distinguish what truly mattered. She discovered that freedom was not measured by possessions, but by the ability to start again. Meanwhile, Richard remained oblivious. Trapped in his arrogance and distracted by Vanessa, he didn't realize that the foundation of his control was crumbling. The irony was cruel. The more he believed he had dominance, the stronger Emily grew in secret. The game was changing, even if he didn't know it. She began to experience small doses of courage. Walking through the neighborhood streets, for the first time she looked at shop windows not as a prisoner, but as someone who might soon choose for herself. These simple moments, which to many might seem trivial, were for her symbols of life. The taste of freedom began to be rehearsed even before it was conquered. Sarah, in turn, kept the flame alive from afar. She called at strategic times, spoke softly but always brought words of encouragement. Emily understood she wasn't just receiving help. She was being pulled out of an abyss by someone who believed in her strength. That made all the difference. In the silence of the night, she trained her mind. She imagined the route, the journey, the arrival. She pictured herself wiping tables, cleaning floors, but with a light heart. These images, repeated like a prayer, gave her strength to endure until the right day. It was like mentally planting the freedom that would soon bloom. And so, every ordinary gesture became a rehearsal for the great moment. The suitcase was no longer just an object hidden in the corner of the room, but the representation of a new life. Emily was about to take the most dangerous leap of all, but also the most liberating. All that was missing was the right moment. Monday dawned like so many others, but for Emily the day had a special meaning. Her heart raced, her hands sweated, and every movement felt like a rehearsal carried out in silence for weeks. Before Richard returned from work, she packed the small suitcase she had been hiding. There was no luxury, only the essentials. And with it she carried the courage saved for years. The clock became both enemy and ally. Each passing minute increased the risk of being discovered, but also brought her closer to freedom. Emily breathed deeply, as if trying to contain her despair while walking toward the door. The silence of the house seemed to conspire both for and against her, echoing each step like a secret about to explode. With the suitcase firm in her hand, she crossed the threshold of the house as if crossing an invisible border. The air felt different, lighter, even though fear still accompanied her. There were no cheers, no witnesses, but inside her it was as if a crowd shouted victory. The first step was taken, and there was no turning back. While Emily moved away, Richard remained, trapped in his routine, convinced he had absolute control. Little did he know that on that day the game would change forever. He would return to an empty house, not realizing he had lost not only his wife, but the foundation of his own arrogance. His proof of love for Vanessa would simply vanish. At Duel, the bus station, Emily blended into the crowd. She was just another face among many anonymous ones, and that comforted her. For the first time in years, anonymity felt like shelter, not prison. Every ticket purchased, every step taken, was a rupture with the past that had kept her captive. Fear still hovered. What if Richard discovered the plan? What if he caught up with her? These questions burned inside her, but they were no longer enough to stop her feet. Emily understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And that day, she chose to walk. On the other side, Sarah waited anxiously. She had already prepared the simple room in her house and even bought a special meal for her cousin's arrival. The arranged phone call between them was the thread that kept hope alive. Sarah knew the escape was not only physical, it was the birth of a new story. At that moment, Emily still wasn't sure what tomorrow would be like, but she knew she could no longer endure yesterday. That awareness was enough to move her. The hard bus seat didn't bother her because every kilometer traveled was a reminder that she was leaving behind the hell that had imprisoned her. And so, night fell over the road, cradling the sound of the engine like a song of freedom. Emily leaned her head against the window and let a silent tear fall. It was not a tear of defeat, but of relief. For the first time, she cried not for pain, but for the possibility of living. The destination was still uncertain, but the escape was already a victory. The next morning, Emily was already in her new destination. Margaret Collins' small diner, though modest, carried the welcoming smell of fresh coffee and newly baked bread. The place was not just a workplace, but a space where every detail seemed to scream freedom. Emily, still bearing visible marks from her escape, saw there the chance to rewrite her own story. The first days were filled with intense physical effort. She scrubbed bathrooms, wiped tables, and swept floors without rest. But unlike the heavy tasks of before, every drop of sweat now had meaning. It wasn't exploitation, it was choice. Emily realized there was dignity even in the simplest work, when done with autonomy. Margaret, the owner of the diner, was an energetic and kind woman. She saw in Emily not just an employee, but a woman willing to fight. Her words of encouragement became a foundation of trust. For Emily, every act of kindness was like a brick laid on a foundation that once seemed impossible, a life without fear. The diner, with its simple tables and regular customers, became a stage for rebirth. Emily watched people smiling, talking, living without chains. That observation nourished her, showing her that ordinary life could be extraordinary when compared to the emotional captivity she had left behind. Her first paycheck was received with tears of gratitude. Not for the amount itself, but for its symbolism. It was the fruit of her own effort, something Richard could never claim as his. That money represented more than sustenance. It represented identity. It represented power. It represented freedom. Sarah, always nearby, celebrated each achievement. Proudly, she saw in Emily an example of strength and perseverance. It wasn't just a cousin helping another. It was a woman witnessing the reconstruction of another. Together, they became a duo against the scars of the past. United by the hope of a better future, Emily learned to smile again even through exhaustion. Small gestures like receiving a tip or hearing a thank you carried immense weight. It was as if every detail was proof that she was alive, that her existence had value, and that she could walk on her own. Her body adapted to the effort, but it was her mind that transformed the most. Each day, Richard's invisible chains weakened. Emily discovered that strength is not measured by the absence of pain, but by the ability to persist despite it. The diner became her arena of daily victory. And so, amid coffee-stained tables and freshly swept floors, Emily found something that had once seemed distant: peace. It wasn't complete peace, but the first step on a path she had chosen for herself. The new beginning wasn't easy, but it was real. And that simple fact made her believe that much more was still to come. With her first paycheck in hand, Emily felt it was time to take another step. She searched for something small, affordable, a place she could call her own. That's how she met Mr. Thomas Reed, a simple and kind man who offered her a modest studio, apartment. The space was tiny, a bedroom, a bathroom, and an improvised kitchen. But for Emily, it was a palace. When she placed the key in the door for the first time, her hands trembled. Each click of the metal in the lock felt like a personal victory. Entering that simple space was like crossing an invisible border. There were no shouts, no fear, no control. Only good silence, the kind that rests the soul. The place had peeling walls and second-hand furniture, but for Emily, every detail had value. The wooden bed, though old, represented rest in peace. The small stove, even worn, was the promise of meals prepared without pressure. The low ceiling, far from suffocating, was the embrace of a home she had chosen herself. Thomas Reed, with his discreet kindness, reinforced the sense of welcome. He didn't ask questions, he simply offered trust. For Emily, that was more important than any luxury, being treated as someone capable of sustaining her own life. The studio wasn't just a physical space, it was the symbol of dignity regained. Nights there were different. Emily lay down and listened to the silence around her. No heavy footsteps, no slamming doors, no voices that wounded. The sound of her own breathing, once muffled by fear, now became music. She discovered that true peace doesn't lie in the size of the house, but in the relief of being able to call it home. With little, Emily began to decorate. A light curtain on the window, a plant in the corner, a colorful cloth on the table. Simple details, but ones that transformed the place into a refuge. Every object placed there carried a meaning. This is mine now, this is safe now, this is a new life now. Her routine began to taste different. She woke up early, tidied the room, and went to work with renewed energy. Coming home was no longer torment but reward. The simple act of opening the door at night became a ritual of gratitude. The studio wasn't big, but it held all the hope in the world. Sarah visited whenever she could, bringing laughter and companionship. The two would talk late into the night like teenagers dreaming of the future. For Emily, sharing that space with someone dear was another reminder that she was no longer alone. The emptiness Richard had imposed no longer had a place. Thus, the studio apartment became a sanctuary. Small, imperfect, but full of meaning. It was proof that Emily could build her life with her own hands. And as she sat at night looking out the window, she knew it was only the beginning of something much greater. The days went by, and Emily dedicated herself body and soul to work. It was no longer just about washing dishes or cleaning tables. It was about rebuilding her identity with every task. The sweat running down her face was different now, because it meant achievement. There was dignity in the effort, and every gesture was a brick laid in the construction of her new life. At the diner, Emily began to build bonds. Lisa Brown and Michael Harris, her co-workers, welcomed her as family. Between laughter during breaks and conversations after shifts, Emily discovered the value of true friendship. Relationships that didn't come from obligation or fear, but from choice and respect. It was like breathing fresh air after years in a closed room. Lisa, always cheerful, became like a sister at heart. Michael, with his calm and empathy, offered the kind of silent support Emily had never known. These simple connections strengthened her spirit. Emily understood that freedom is not just having a roof over your head, but also having people who remind you of your worth. Her body, once fragile from the marks of pain, now gained resilience. Daily work strengthened her muscles and also her mind. Each day overcome was proof that there were no limits to what she could achieve. Emily discovered that strength wasn't born from the absence of falls, but from the decision to rise every time it was necessary. The invisible chains Richard had placed on her began to weaken. The fear that once dictated her steps was now giving way to courage. Emily started walking with her head held high, realizing she no longer had to hide. Life outside the shadows was harder, but also infinitely more beautiful. Sarah watched this transformation with pride. Seeing Emily blossom was witnessing a daily miracle. Each achievement of her cousin was also a victory against the silence and oppression that had tried to suffocate her. Sarah knew that this process was only the beginning of a lifetime of possibilities. Nights in the studio apartment, once just moments of rest, became times of reflection. Emily borrowed books, wrote thoughts in a simple notebook, and dreamed of going back to school. She realized that starting over wasn't just about surviving, but about allowing herself to desire more. Much more. There were days of extreme exhaustion when her body begged for pause. But even in those moments, Emily found meaning. She felt alive, active part of the world. The weight of routine was no longer a burden but a sign of belonging. She was no longer a spectator of her own story. She was the protagonist. And so, among clean tables, warm conversations, and dreams scribbled on loose pages, Emily realized that starting over was not a distant destination, but a daily path. Each step taken reaffirmed her strength, and every shared smile was proof that she was finally free to live. Time had passed, and Emily was different. Her posture was upright, her voice firm, and the eyes that once carried fear now shone with confidence. She was no longer the woman who endured in silence. She was someone who had rebuilt her own foundations. And it was in this state of wholeness that destiny decided to test her strength. Richard appeared in town like a ghost from the past. He was no longer the arrogant man of before, wrapped in power and money. Now, with wrinkled clothes and a worn-out expression, he carried the weight of defeat on his face. Vanessa had abandoned him, and without resources, he wandered in search of something that no longer existed. When his eyes met Emily's, he trembled. Standing before him was not the victim, but the woman risen from the ashes. Richard tried to approach with false tears, promising change. He cried, begged, offered. Words he once wielded as weapons, but there was no room for manipulation anymore. Emily was someone else. She was not alone. At her side were Sarah, Lisa, Michael, and even Margaret, all witnesses of her journey. It was as if life itself had placed each of these people as a shield around her. Richard, used to dominating, felt for the first time what it meant to be powerless. His presence no longer held any authority. Emily listened to every word calmly. There was no hatred in her eyes, but neither was there weakness. Only a cutting clarity. She knew who she was and what she would no longer accept. That serenity was, for Richard, the most painful defeat, because there was nothing he could do to break that new foundation. The roles had reversed. He was the one begging, fragile, abandoned. Emily, on the other hand, was the steady rock. The contrast was so stark that even the bystanders around them could see it. It wasn't just a reunion, but a public revelation. His power had evaporated, and hers had blossomed. Richard tried to cling to the past, recalling promises, inventing excuses. But each word dissolved into the air like smoke. Emily remained silent, simply looking, and in that silence there was more strength than in any speech. He finally understood that he could no longer control her. The meeting wasn't marked by shouts or violent confrontations. It was marked by something much greater, the absence of fear. Emily didn't need to raise her voice or justify herself. Her simple posture showed that she had won. Sometimes the greatest victory is the secure silence of someone who no longer bows down. And in that instant, with everyone by her side and her dignity intact, Emily was certain. Destiny had given her the chance to look back without losing herself in it. It wasn't about revenge, but about realizing she had survived, rebuilt, and triumphed. Richard was part of a past that no longer defined her. Emily knew the reunion was not the end, but only the preparation for something greater. For years, Richard believed she was just a shadow dependent on his presence. But now, with evidence kept in silence and trusted witnesses, Emily was ready to turn her pain into justice. It was time to rewrite not only her story but also his. The courtroom became the stage of truth. There sat Richard, facing Judge Robert Anderson, trying to recover the arrogant posture that no longer belonged to him. His words sounded empty. His excuses fell into ridicule. For the first time, the power was not in his voice but in the evidence against him. Emily, in turn, stood firm. She did not speak with resentment but with clarity. She presented each document, each account, each testimony. Sarah, Lisa, Michael, and even Margaret were there like living walls by her side. What had once been silence now became a chorus of truths that could no longer be ignored. The judge listened to everything attentively. Robert Anderson did not see just a marital dispute, but a case of abuse, humiliation, and violence. His sentence was clear and firm. Richard would lose not only his freedom but also his reputation. The chains he once used to bind Emily now turned against him, in the form of law and condemnation. For Richard, the weight of defeat was unbearable. Behind bars, there was no room for manipulative speeches or empty promises. The man who once considered himself untouchable now found himself reduced to nothing. It was the cruel reflection of his own choices, and no one could save him. Emily, however, did not celebrate with shouts. Her victory had another taste. It was the silent triumph of someone who survived, restarted, and won. She did not need to stain her hands with violence. It was enough to rise with dignity. Her revenge was not in another's suffering, but in the freedom she had achieved. Every step from then on was taken with the certainty that she would never again be a prisoner. Emily walked the streets knowing her story could inspire other women. What had once been pain now became voice, and her life was proof that it is possible to turn tears into resilience. The invisible chains had been broken forever. Emily understood that she did not need to erase the past, but to use it as fuel for a stronger future. Her scars were not shame, but silent medals of a battle won, and that no court, no man, could ever take away from her. Thus, the cycle closed. The woman who once lived in silence now stood in fullness. The world might try to bring her down again, but she already knew how to rise. And deep down, that was the true victory. Not only defeating Richard, but proving to herself that she was indestructible. And now, I want to ask you a direct question. How many times have you stayed silent in the face of something that hurt you, believing there was no way out? Emily's story proves that there is always a path, but it takes courage to take the first step. Are you willing to face your own fears and rewrite your story? If this journey inspired you, don't let it go unnoticed. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and keep learning with me, because every week I bring new stories and reflections that can open your eyes, spark change, and maybe even awaken your own strength to start over.